I remember the first time I pulled into Willow Creek Estates. The sun was shining, casting golden light over the perfectly manicured lawns and white picket fences. My SUV hummed softly as I drove down the tree-lined street. The houses all neatly aligned like soldiers in formation. Each property was pristine, trimmed hedges, flower beds bursting with color, and not a stray leaf in sight. It felt like I had stumbled into a postcard. This is it, I whispered to myself. After years of saving and working overtime, I had finally managed to buy my dream home, a modest but charming 3-bedroom house with a large backyard and a wraparound porch. My job as a software developer had been paying well, and I was ready to settle down. No more noisy apartments or rude neighbors. Willow Creek Estates promised peace, safety, and a strong sense of community. My real estate agent had spoken highly of the HOA, how they maintained high property values and kept the neighborhood looking pristine. It sounded like a dream. I figured a few rules about keeping the trash bins hidden or mowing the lawn regularly were a small price to pay for this level of perfection. The day I moved in, several neighbors came by to introduce themselves. An older couple, Doris and Frank Wilson, brought over a basket of muffins. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Doris had said with a warm smile. "Let us know if you need anything." "You'll love it here," Frank added. "Just make sure you keep up with the rules." That last line stuck with me, but I brushed it off. Every neighborhood had its quirks. How bad could it be? 3 months passed uneventfully. I met a few more neighbors during evening walks and started feeling like part of the community. I even joined a neighborhood barbecue hosted by the Wilsons. Things were going well, until the day my sister, Melissa, and her kids came for a visit. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when it all began to unravel. Melissa and the kids arrived mid-morning, their minivan packed with bags and a cooler of snacks. After 6 months without seeing them, I was thrilled to have them over for the weekend. I fired up the grill. The kids ran to the sprinkler in the backyard, and laughter filled the air. The smell of grilled burgers mingled with the summer breeze as Melissa sat on a lawn chair, cradling a cold drink. Her kids, Jacob and Emily, were squealing with joy as they chased each other across the grass. For the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. Then a sharp voice cut through the happiness like a knife. "Excuse me, what exactly is happening here?" I turned toward the sound and saw a woman in her 50s striding across my lawn with the authority of a general surveying her troops. Perfectly styled blonde hair framed a tanned, severe face. A floral blouse was buttoned to her neck despite the summer heat, and she clutched a clipboard like a weapon. "Can I help you?" I asked, lowering my spatula. She stepped closer, looking past me at the kids and Melissa. Her eyes narrowed. "I'm Eleanor Thompson," she said crisply, "president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. I noticed some unregistered guests on your property." "Unregistered?" I frowned. "This is my sister and her kids. They're visiting for the weekend." Eleanor's lips thinned. According to Section 3.12 of the HOA bylaws, all visitors must be registered with the HOA office at least 72 hours prior to their arrival. My sister sat up. "We're family," she said. "We're not exactly strangers." "The rules apply to everyone," Eleanor replied coldly. "Unregistered guests are considered a security risk. Also," she pointed toward the minivan in the driveway, "that vehicle is parked improperly." "You got to be kidding me," I said, half laughing. "I assure you I am not." Eleanor scribbled something on her clipboard. "This constitutes a formal warning. 3 violations result in fines." I set down my spatula, feeling the heat rising in my chest. "Look, I wasn't aware of this rule. Now I know. I'll register them first thing Monday." Eleanor's smile was thin and sharp. "That's not how it works. They need to leave immediately and return after proper registration." My father, who had been quietly sitting on the patio with a glass of iced tea, stood up. Judge William Davis was a tall man with sharp features and a presence that commanded respect. His graying hair gave him a dignified air, and when he spoke, people listened. "Eleanor, is it?" he said calmly. "Are you suggesting my grandchildren can't visit their uncle without paperwork?" Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "And you are—" "William Davis, federal judge. Eastern District. I watched a mental calculation flash across Eleanor's face. She straightened her blouse. Well, she said tightly, even judges must follow HOA regulations. Rules maintain property values. Mr. Davis. My father's expression remained calm. I'd be very interested to see the legal precedent supporting an HOA's authority to restrict family visitation on private property. Eleanor's smile faltered. It's in the covenant. My father's gaze sharpened. We'll see about that. Eleanor's posture stiffened. I'll overlook this violation just this once, she said, her tone heavy with condescension. But please ensure future visitors are properly registered. She turned and marched away, clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. My father sat back down and took a sip of his tea. Interesting woman, he said. I'd suggest reading your HOA covenant very carefully, son. Later that evening, my father sat with me. That HOA president reminds me of cases I've handled. Dad said, "What kind of cases?" "People who confuse authority with power," he replied. "There's a difference." I sighed. I'm sure it's just an overzealous board member. Probably nothing to worry about. Dad's gaze darkened. Maybe. He swirled the ice in his glass. But in my experience, people who monitor children playing in backyards rarely stop there. I had no idea how right he was. The next morning, I found a pink slip taped to my front door. A formal notice from the HOA citing 3 violations from the previous day. Unregistered visitors. Noise disturbance. Improper vehicle parking. Beside it was a flyer for the neighborhood 4th of July celebration, featuring Eleanor Thompson as Grand Marshal. I crumpled the pink slip and tossed it into the trash. By the following week, I started noticing other things. A black SUV frequently cruised past my house. Neighbors would quickly disappear from their porches when I passed. On Thursday evening, as I took out the trash, a man with thinning hair and a golf shirt appeared on my driveway. "James Davis?" "Yes." He smiled thinly. "I'm Martin Greenberg, HOA Vice President. I wanted to deliver this personally." He handed me another pink slip. "A $500 fine?" I asked, stunned. "Violation number 2, Martin said, looking pleased with himself. Visitors were not properly registered. "These were my parents," I said. "They surprised me for my birthday." Martin's smile didn't reach his eyes. Rules are rules. I started asking around. My neighbor Sam had lived in Willow Creek Estates for 5 years. Has the HOA always been this intense? I asked him one afternoon. Sam glanced over his shoulder before answering. It got worse when Eleanor became president last year. What happens if people push back? Sam's face darkened. The Ramirez family tried once. Their garbage stopped being collected. Landscaping violations started appearing out of nowhere. Eventually, they moved. It was 5:30 in the morning when my phone's sharp ringtone jolted me awake. My heart hammered as I reached the phone. It was my sister Kate. Her voice was strained and trembling. "Jake, my water just broke," she said, her breathing ragged. "It's too early. The baby's not due for 6 weeks." "Stay calm," I said, already throwing off the covers and pulling on a hoodie. "I'm coming." Kate and her husband Tom had been staying with me for a few days while their house was being renovated. The doctor had assured them they still had time before the baby arrived. Clearly, the baby had other plans. I burst into their room to find Kate doubled over on the edge of the bed, clutching her belly. Tom was frantically stuffing clothes into a duffel bag. "Breathe, Kate," I said, helping her to her feet. "We're leaving now." Tom grabbed her hospital bag, and we shuffled down the hallway. Kate winced as another contraction hit. Her face twisted in pain, and my stomach knotted with panic. "We'll be at the hospital in 15 minutes, I said, trying to sound confident. I got Kate settled in the passenger seat, while Tom climbed into the back. As I backed out of the driveway, headlights suddenly flashed in front of me. A black SUV slid into place, blocking the exit. I blinked confused and horrified. Eleanor Thompson stepped out of the SUV, her perfectly styled hair untouched by the humid night air. Beside her stood Martin Greenberg and Diane Perkins, the HOA secretary, both in press clothes despite the early hour. Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she approached the car. "Going somewhere?" she asked coldly. I gripped the steering wheel. "My sister is in labor. We're going to the hospital." Eleanor's mouth twitched. "I don't see a visitor registration for your sister and her husband." "You can't be serious," I snapped. "It's a violation of the HOA's visitor policy," Martin added smugly. "Unregistered guests must vacate the premises." "She's in labor," I shouted. "Get out of the way." Eleanor's expression didn't change. "Rules don't bend for emergencies," she said. Kate screamed, her hand gripping the dashboard as another contraction hit. Tom jumped out of the back seat. "Please, we need to leave." Martin took out his phone. "Another violation to document," he said, starting to record. "You have lost your mind," I said through gritted teeth. "Move. Your car." Eleanor crossed her arms. "Not without proper registration." Kate screamed again. I glanced down and saw blood on her pants. My heart pounded in my ears. "Call an ambulance," I yelled to Tom. He was already dialing. Neighbors started appearing at their windows. Mrs. Wilson from across the street rushed out in her bathrobe. "Eleanor, what the hell are you doing?" Mrs. Wilson demanded. "Stay out of this, Doris." Eleanor snapped. "This is HOA business." "No, it's not," Mrs. Wilson yelled back. "This is insane." The distant sound of sirens finally pierced the tense air. An ambulance rounded the corner and pulled up behind Eleanor's SUV. The paramedics had to park on the street and wheel a gurney around the block driveway. Kate was barely conscious when they loaded her into the ambulance. Tom climbed in beside her. I turned to Eleanor, shaking with rage. "You're going to regret this," I said. Eleanor's smile was thin and cruel. "I don't think so, Mr. Davis." My father showed up at the hospital later that morning, his face pale with fury. Kate had delivered a tiny but healthy baby girl, but she was still being monitored in the NICU. Dad sat beside me in the waiting room. That was when I knew Eleanor and Martin had crossed a line they wouldn't recover from. "What happened?" he asked quietly. I told him everything. The block driveway, the refusal to let us leave, the smugness in Eleanor's face as Kate bled in the front seat. "She endangered a life," he said, voice sharp. I nodded, and she knew exactly what she was doing. Dad exhaled slowly. "Text me Eleanor and Martin's full names," he said. "Why?" "Because I'm going to find out exactly what kind of authority this HOA thinks it has." When I got home later that day, I found my father at the kitchen table with his laptop open and papers spread across the surface. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Research," he replied. "You signed a contract when you bought the house, correct?" "Yeah." "Did you read it carefully?" "Not exactly," I admitted. It was like 50 pages of legal jargon. Dad's eyes sharpened. "That's what they count on." The next day, Dad handed me a printout. "Take a look at this." It was a copy of the Willow Creek Estates HOA incorporation papers, or lack thereof. They never properly filed with the county, Dad explained. This HOA was never officially recognized under county law. My eyebrows rose. "What does that mean?" "It means half the rules they're enforcing have no legal standing," Dad said. "But that's just the beginning." He tapped another document. "This is a list of payments from the HOA's financial records," he said. "Notice a pattern?" I squinted at the names. Greenberg Landscaping. Greenberg Landscaping. Over and over. "Martin's company." I said. Dad nodded. Over the past 5 years, Martin Greenberg's landscaping company has received over $400,000 from the HOA, at 3 times the market rate. My mouth dropped open. "That's theft." "It's worse than that." Dad's eyes narrowed. "Because Eleanor's signature is on every one of these payments." I sat back. "So they've been bleeding the HOA dry?" "Yes, and they've been covering it up by issuing fines and penalties to offset the missing funds." I clenched my jaw. "They're using us as their personal ATM." "Exactly," Dad said. "And now we have proof." Later that evening, I got an email from the HOA. New community security guidelines. All guests must provide identification upon entry. Visitors must undergo a background check. New visitor badges will be required for any stay over 12 hours. At the bottom was a line that made my blood boil. These changes are necessary to maintain the safety and integrity of Willow Creek Estates following recent security concerns. They're doubling down, I told Dad. They're scared, he replied. And when people like Eleanor get scared, they tighten their grip. Later that night, I received a text from an unknown number. Don't fight them. They always win. Tuesday night arrived with a storm hanging low over the neighborhood. The HOA board meeting was held at the community center. I almost didn't go, but my father insisted. We walked in to find Eleanor and Martin seated at the front of the room, flanked by Diane and the other board members. Neighbors packed the seats, whispering nervously. Eleanor stood. We're here to discuss new community guidelines. The double doors at the back of the room swung open. A group of men and women in suits entered, carrying briefcases. A tall woman in a gray suit stepped forward. Eleanor Thompson? Eleanor's face paled. Yes. I'm Claire Reynolds from a county oversight committee, the woman said. This is a legal inspection under County Code 43.7. We'll need access to all financial records and operational documents. You can't just barge in here, Eleanor began. Actually, Claire interrupted, we can. Martin's face was red as he whispered furiously to Eleanor. She was already losing control, and for the first time, the fear in her eyes was real. Looks like the game's over, my father murmured beside me. For the first time since it started, I smiled. The fallout from the audit was immediate and brutal. News of the county inspection spread through Willow Creek Estates like wildfire. Neighbors whispered on the sidewalks and gathered in hushed groups at the park. For the first time, Eleanor wasn't the one setting the narrative. The power was shifting, and she knew it. The HOA called for an emergency board meeting the following Thursday. I knew it wasn't going to be pretty, but I wasn't prepared for just how ugly it would get. The community center was packed when I arrived. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls, standing shoulder to shoulder. My father sat beside me in the back row, arms crossed, eyes sharp. Neighbors leaned in close, whispering to each other. Eleanor sat at the front of the room behind a long table, flanked by Martin and Diane. She wore a crisp white suit, her blonde hair pinned back in a tight bun. Martin sat stiffly beside her, sweat glistening on his forehead. Diane adjusted her glasses nervously. Eleanor stood and tapped the microphone. Due to recent events, she began, her voice cold and measured, the HOA board has decided to review our policies to maintain the integrity of Willow Creek Estates. Murmurs rippled through the room. A hand shot up near the front. Are you talking about the county investigation? Asked Mrs. Wilson. Eleanor's mouth tightened. The investigation is a routine compliance review. A man in the second row stood. Routine compliance review? My garbage hasn't been collected in 3 weeks because of your routine compliance. Another voice rose. Is it true Martin's company was getting paid 3 times the market rate for landscaping? Martin sat up straighter. That is an unfounded allegation. It's not, someone else shouted. Judge Davis showed us the financial records. A wave of shouting and angry voices swept through the room. Eleanor slammed the gavel down hard. Enough, she barked. My father leaned toward me. She's losing control, he whispered. Eleanor's eyes scanned the crowd. Then she pointed directly at me. This, she said, her voice sharp, is all happening because of James Davis and his father. They have conspired to destroy the order of this community. All eyes turned toward me. My heart pounded. I stood slowly. My father placed a steadying hand on my shoulder as I stepped toward the front of the room. Let me make one thing clear, I said, keeping my voice calm. I moved here because I love this community. But loving a place doesn't mean allowing a small group of people to abuse their authority. The room was deathly quiet. This isn't about visitor policies. I continued. This is about accountability. It's about fairness. We can't live in a neighborhood where rules are enforced selectively, where some people benefit while others are punished. You have no proof of wrongdoing, Eleanor snapped. That's funny. I said, turning toward the back of the room. Because I believe Claire Reynolds from the County Oversight Committee would disagree. The same tall woman in the gray suit from the audit stepped forward. We've uncovered significant financial misconduct, Claire said calmly, including fraudulent contracts and misuse of funds. Eleanor's mouth opened and closed. You have no authority to... Actually, Claire said, we do. The room erupted in noise, shouting, accusations, disbelief. Eleanor and Martin looked frozen in place. The county will be filing charges, Claire announced over the noise, pending completion of the investigation. Martin jumped to his feet. This is outrageous. Claire ignored him and turned toward Eleanor. Miss Thompson, the county has also determined that the visitor ban and security measures instituted under your leadership were illegal under county law. Eleanor's face twisted with fury. You have no idea what you're doing, she hissed. Claire smiled. I think we know exactly what we're doing. Martin shot to his feet and pointed at Claire. You can't charge us. We acted under the authority of the HOA. Claire's expression sharpened. The HOA was never properly incorporated. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's face paled. You think you've won? Eleanor spat at me. We'll take this to court. My father stood. His voice was calm, but his eyes were hard. I look forward to seeing you in court, he said. 2 days later, the headline hit the local news. HOA president and board vice president face fraud charges. The charges included embezzlement, racketeering, and falsification of documents. The county froze all HOA accounts and suspended the board's authority. I stood on my front porch the morning after the news broke, watching as 2 black sedans pulled up in front of Eleanor's house. 2 officers emerged. Eleanor stepped outside, wearing a fitted gray suit. She was composed, but I saw the tightness in her jaw. Martin came out next, looking sweaty and disheveled. He tried to smile at the officers. Eleanor turned toward me. Our eyes met. Her expression was cold and cutting. This isn't over, she mouthed. One of the officers placed handcuffs on her wrists. She stiffened but didn't resist. Martin wasn't as composed. He shouted something about misunderstandings and legal authority as the officers led them both to the car. Neighbors gathered on their porches, watching in stunned silence. They thought they were untouchable. My father said beside me, Not anymore. I replied. Over the next month, the HOA board dissolved completely. Eleanor and Martin faced trial. The county placed Willow Creek Estates under temporary administration while new leadership was selected. The neighborhood held a special election for the new board. Doris Wilson asked me to run for HOA president. At first, I refused, but my father encouraged me. You fought back when it mattered, he said. Now make sure it never happens again. I was elected by a landslide. Mrs. Wilson became the treasurer. Sam took over community maintenance. For the first time, the HOA was composed of people who actually live there, not people looking to profit. Our first order of business was updating the visitor policy. All families are welcome anytime. The new bylaw read. When the vote passed unanimously, the room broke into applause. My father sat at the back of the room, smiling. 6 months later, I sat on my porch, watching my nieces and nephews play in the street. The neighborhood felt different, lighter. Neighbors smiled at each other again. Eleanor and Martin were found guilty of fraud and sentenced to 7 years in prison. The state ordered full restitution of the stolen funds, including $200,000 earmarked for the community pool. I looked toward the pool, where Mrs. Wilson sat with her grandchildren. The water sparkled under the afternoon sun. My father sat beside me, sipping iced tea. Funny, he said, how all this could have been avoided if Eleanor had just let your sister visit. I laughed. Some people just can't give up control. Dad's expression grew serious. Authority is not the same as power. Eleanor used authority to control people, but real power lies in trust and accountability. He looked at me, and you held him accountable. I smiled, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. That's what neighbors are supposed to do. I said, power without accountability is dangerous. Authority should serve the people, not control them. As the sun dipped lower, I watched my family laugh and play. For the first time since moving into Willow Creek Estates, I knew this was home.